Chapter 1. The Last Chance. The battlefield on Viridian 4 was nothing like Marcus Grayson had ever imagined. Explosions erupted in the distance, filling the sky with plumes of smoke as laser beams cracked through the air, sizzling in all directions. The once beautiful planet, covered with lush forests and serene oceans, had now become a war zone. The fight between the United Earth Forces and the Corsian Dominion had dragged on for weeks, leaving the planet's surface scarred and burning. Marcus, a seasoned soldier in the human resistance, had seen his fair share of destruction, but there was something different about the chaos here. The air was thick with the smell of burning debris, the distant cries of the wounded, and the ever-present sound of warships soaring overhead. His mission was clear: hold the line, protect the few remaining civilians in the area, and ensure the enemy couldn't breach their defenses. But deep down, Marcus knew that every passing moment was another step closer to their inevitable fall. As he sprinted through the ruined streets of what had once been a thriving colony, Marcus felt the weight of his armor pressing down on him, a constant reminder of the war he was a part of. His plasma rifle felt heavier than usual, the strain of constant battle taking its toll. The Corsians were relentless, pressing forward with their superior numbers and advanced weaponry. But Marcus wasn't about to let that stop him. Not when he had a job to do. "Sergeant Grayson, we've got movement up ahead," a voice crackled through his comm device. It was Lieutenant Mara Voss, his second in command. She had a sharp mind, an even sharper aim, and Marcus trusted her more than anyone else on the field. "On my way, Lieutenant," Marcus replied, adjusting his helmet and heading toward the location she had indicated. The sound of laser fire grew louder, and the ground beneath his feet trembled as another explosion rocked the area. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward, weaving through the wreckage of buildings and overturned vehicles, each step bringing him closer to his team's position. As he turned a corner, Marcus froze. In front of him, partially concealed behind a collapsed wall, was a young woman. She was lying on the ground, blood staining her clothing, her chest rising and falling erratically. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old, with dark hair matted against her forehead and a look of sheer panic on her face. The Corsian forces were nowhere in sight, but she wasn't moving, her body clearly battered by something much worse than just a physical assault. Marcus's heart skipped a beat as he rushed to her side, scanning the area for threats. His training kicked in immediately. He checked for a pulse weak, but still there. The woman was alive, but just barely. "Stay with me," Marcus muttered, kneeling beside her and examining her injuries. The wound on her side was deep, and the blood was pouring out far too quickly for his liking. Her breathing was shallow, each inhale a struggle. She groaned softly, her eyes flickering open for a moment before she weakly turned her head to look at him. Her gaze was clouded with pain and confusion, but there was something else in her eyes, something desperate, something that reached out to him. She tried to speak, but her words were barely audible, drowned out by the sounds of distant war. "Help me." It was all she managed before her eyes closed again, and her body went limp in his arms. The decision. Marcus cursed under his breath, his mind racing. He didn't have time to play doctor. He had a team to lead, civilians to protect, and an entire army of Corsian soldiers to fight. But this girl, this human girl, was the only thing that mattered right now. He couldn't just leave her to die. With no medical supplies on hand and no time to waste, Marcus made a snap decision. He removed his oxygen mask and held it to her lips, forcing his own breath into her. He could feel her body growing colder, her pulse weakening with every passing second. He couldn't let her die not like this, not on his watch. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked at the wound again. There was no medical kit, no stimulants, no easy way to stop the bleeding. Desperation took over. Without thinking, Marcus made the boldest move of his life. He pricked his own finger, drawing a small amount of his own blood into a sterile syringe from his belt. It wasn't the perfect solution, wasn't even a guaranteed one, but it was something. Using the small amount of medical knowledge he had, he quickly administered the blood directly into her veins, hoping the hemoglobin would boost her body's ability to heal. It was a risk, but it was the only option he had. As soon as the blood entered her system, he held his breath. For a moment, nothing happened. He could only feel the weight of time pressing down on him as the distant sounds of battle continued to rage. Then, just as hope began to fade, Her eyes fluttered open once again. Her gaze locked onto his, and Marcus felt his pulse quicken. She was alive. The blood was working. "Why?" she whispered, her voice weak but clear. "Why did you give me your blood?" Marcus's breath came in short, ragged bursts as he tried to steady himself. He had no answer. There was no rational explanation for what he had just done. All he knew was that her life mattered, that she was worth saving. He hadn't even thought of the consequences. He had acted on instinct. "Because you're worth it." It was all he could say, his voice a little more than a rasp. The girl managed a small, faint smile, her lips trembling as she tried to sit up. The effort seemed to drain her, and she slumped back against the debris. Marcus caught her in time, holding her steady as she tried to push herself up. "I don't know who you are, or why you saved me," she murmured, but there was a hint of gratitude in her voice. Her eyes closed again, and she seemed to be drifting in and out of consciousness. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he looked down at her. Who was she? She didn't look like a civilian. She looked like someone who had been caught in the crossfire, someone who had just barely managed to survive this hell. But he couldn't leave her there not like this. Before he could ask any more questions, the faint hum of a Corsian warship grew louder in the distance, and his instincts kicked in. Time was running out. "We need to move now." He lifted her carefully, cradling her fragile form against his chest. "Hold on, just a little longer. I'm not leaving you behind." The escape. It wasn't easy. Marcus carried her through the debris-strewn streets, his heart racing as he ducked behind cover, all while the sounds of the battlefield grew ever closer. He couldn't afford to be seen, and he certainly couldn't afford to be caught. The Corsian fleet would be landing soon, and once they did, there would be no escaping them. They reached the hidden entrance to the underground bunker where his team had set up their evacuation point. His mind raced as he checked his surroundings for any signs of danger. He didn't know who this girl was, or why she was in this war-torn city, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't letting her die. As the hatch closed behind them, locking out the chaos of the outside world, Marcus finally allowed himself to relax just a little. He set the girl down on a makeshift cot and took a step back. She was still alive. "You're safe now," Marcus whispered, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. Her eyes fluttered again, this time with more awareness. "Thank you." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but Marcus heard it clearly. There was something about her words that struck him, a sense of gratitude. Yes, but something else. Something deeper. He could feel his heart racing again. She had survived, but he knew that the danger wasn't over yet. It was only a matter of time before the Empire's forces found them. And when they did, Marcus would fight with everything he had. Chapter 2. A Debt of Blood. The quiet hum of the underground bunker was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. The soft beeping of diagnostic machines and the muffled sound of human voices were the only things that kept Marcus grounded as he stood watch, his gaze fixed on the young woman lying on the cot. She had been unconscious for hours, her condition stabilizing, but the fight wasn't over. Her body was still too fragile to be sure of her survival. He paced the narrow corridor of the bunker, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The Corsian forces would soon discover that the last remnants of the colony were hidden here. They'd stop at nothing to eliminate any opposition, to crush any remaining resistance. The Empire had already claimed so many lives, and Marcus wasn't going to let the girl be one of them, not if he could help it. He stopped in front of a small medical station set up near the far wall, the soft blue glow of the healing pods lighting the room. He glanced back at the cot. She had started to stir, the rise and fall of her chest steadying with each breath, but her eyes still flickered with confusion. She was alive just barely, and Marcus couldn't help but feel a strange sense of protectiveness toward her. He wasn't sure why. He didn't know her. She wasn't anyone special, at least. He didn't think she was. But after saving her life, after giving his blood to keep her alive, he felt responsible for her. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Sergeant Grayson," the voice of Lieutenant Maravas crackled over the comms. "We've set up perimeter defenses, but there's still no word from HQ. The Empire's forces are closing in. They're at the outskirts of the city." Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. "Understood," he muttered, trying to shake off the fatigue that was beginning to wear him down. The tension in his neck was nearly unbearable, but he had no time for rest. Not yet. He turned to leave the medical station, but his eyes briefly caught the figure on the cot again. She was awake, her dark eyes now blinking open and closing, her gaze confused but calm. Slowly, she lifted herself, pushing her arms up to prop herself into a sitting position. The movement was sluggish, her body betraying the weakness she still felt, but there was a certain fire in her eyes now, a determination that Marcus couldn't quite place. He walked over to her, his boots softly tapping on the metal floor. As he approached, she noticed him and tried to smile, but the effort drained her strength. She winced, clearly in pain, but her words still managed to escape her lips. "Where am I?" Her voice was raspy, thin, but it had a warmth to it that made Marcus pause. She wasn't just a survivor. She wasn't some faceless civilian he had saved out of obligation. She was human, like him, and in some inexplicable way, she had already become important to him. "You're safe," Marcus said quietly, sitting beside her on the cot, but maintaining some distance. He didn't want to make her feel cornered. "You're in a resistance bunker. The Empire's forces are out there, and we're doing everything we can to protect the last of the civilians." Her gaze softened as she looked around at the sterile environment, the dull lights hanging overhead. She seemed to be absorbing the situation, but it was clear her body was still too weak to fully process everything. She opened her mouth, perhaps to ask more questions, but Marcus stopped her with a raised hand. "You've been through a lot, and you need rest," he said gently. "I'll be right here. Just take it easy. You're not alone anymore." There was a brief silence between them before she spoke again, her voice now quieter, a trace of vulnerability creeping in. "Why did you save me?" she asked, her tone uncertain, almost lost. "You didn't know me. I could have been anyone." Marcus's chest tightened. He wasn't used to these kinds of questions, not in the middle of a war, not after everything he had seen. But for some reason, this girl was different. There was an empathy in her voice that he couldn't ignore. He stared at his hands for a moment, the weight of his decision to give his blood still fresh in his memory. "I don't know. Maybe because you deserve to live." Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, he saw something flash across her face, something that was part relief and part thankfulness. But there was more. Something deeper, something unspoken. Her voice softened further. "Thank you." The words were barely a whisper, but they carried a weight far greater than any other words spoken in the war. Marcus stood, his posture stiff, trying to shake off the tension that was creeping into his muscles. "It's my job. I don't need thanks. I just dash." He stopped himself. "I just did what was right." She smiled slightly, a faint, almost shy smile. Then she shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing something for the first time. "I don't even know your name. You saved my life, and I don't even know who you are." Marcus paused, the weight of the question catching him off guard. For a split second, he wasn't sure how to answer. He wasn't used to this kind of connection, wasn't used to feeling anything other than the cold distance that kept him focused on the mission. "I'm Sergeant Marcus Grayson," he replied, offering a small, stiff smile. "Just a soldier. Doing my job." She nodded, as if processing his words. Her body relaxed slightly, as if she were willing to trust him. "I'm Ella." The name hung in the air for a moment, and Marcus felt something shift within him. Ella, not just a survivor, but a person with her own story. A person he had saved, yes, but one who was slowly becoming more than just someone he had patched up in the middle of a war. Before he could respond, the comms interrupted again, and Marcus's shoulders tensed. This time, it was Lieutenant Voss's voice again, but with an urgency that made Marcus's blood run cold. "Sergeant Grayson, we have incoming. The Corsian fleet has detected us. They're preparing to land. We need to make a move now." Marcus exhaled, his hand tightening around the console. It was time. They couldn't wait any longer. The war had reached them, and if they didn't act now, it would be over. He turned to Ella, who was still sitting weakly on the cot. "You need to stay here, Ella. It's not safe to move yet. Let us handle this." She looked at him with a defiant gleam in her eye, as if she wasn't about to let herself be sidelined. But Marcus was already striding toward the door, a sense of duty overriding any personal connection. The mission came first. Chapter 3. The Enemy Within. The stillness of the bunker was abruptly shattered by the loud clatter of boots against metal as Marcus rushed toward the command center. His thoughts were clouded, not just by the urgency of the approaching Empire's forces, but by the girl Ella. He couldn't help but feel a strange connection to her, a bond formed in the chaos of the battle. She had been almost dead, yet his actions had brought her back to life. And now, she was sitting alone in a bunker, waiting for the war to find her. Marcus had to wonder if his decision to save her was a good one, especially if it put her life in even more danger. But those thoughts were for another time. For now, the Empire was approaching, and Marcus couldn't afford to second-guess himself. The Resistance forces were already making their last preparations, but Outlaw forces had few options left. The Corsian Empire would likely launch a full offensive if they didn't move quickly. And the Ceradix-class warship, now his greatest asset, wasn't something they could just let fall into enemy hands. Inside the bunker's command room, the team was already set. Lieutenant Maravas was manning the communications console, her fingers flying across the interface as she monitored the fleet's movements. She turned as Marcus entered, giving him a quick nod. "They're getting closer," Mara reported, her voice firm but tinged with concern. "If we don't make a move soon, we'll be surrounded. I'm not sure we have enough time to prep the ship for another jump. The coordinates are locked, but we'll need a diversion." Marcus nodded. His mind was already running the numbers. Escape wasn't really an option right now. He could feel the weight of the Ceradix on his shoulders. Was their only chance. He turned to the rest of his team, a group of seasoned soldiers, each of whom looked ready for whatever came next. "We're not leaving this place unless we have to," Marcus said, his voice steady, but there was a noticeable edge to it. "We'll hold this position as long as we can, and when the time comes, we'll push forward. Mara, you keep those shields up. I'll take a team to prep the ship. The rest of you, prepare for anything. We don't have time for a slow retreat." Mara gave a curt nod, her eyes hard with determination. She knew as well as he did that every second counted. Before Marcus could continue his orders, there was a sharp sound from the comm system. A low voice crackled through the speakers. "Sergeant Grayson, we have an emergency." Marcus straightened, tension shooting through his body as his hands instinctively reached for his weapon. "Go ahead," he said, voice sharp. "It's Ella. She's gone missing from the medical bay. We can't find her anywhere." "What?" Marcus hissed, disbelief hitting him like a blow to the chest. He glanced over at the rest of the team, whose faces mirrored his confusion. His heart skipped a beat. The girl, she couldn't have gotten far. He turned to Mara. "Get the perimeter up. I'll find her." The bunker suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in around him. He'd been so focused on the approaching threat that he hadn't thought to check on Ella. But now she was gone, and he didn't know if that meant she had left on her own or if something else had happened. He hurried through the narrow hallways of the bunker, his boots pounding against the floor as he made his way back to the medical station. His thoughts were racing. Was she in danger? Had she wandered off in some delirium? Or had the Empire's spies somehow found their way into the bunker? But when he reached the medical bay, the room was empty. The cot where Ella had been lying was cold, the sheets untouched. Panic set in as he checked the doors. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication that anything out of the ordinary had happened. "Ella," he called out softly, his voice carrying through the room. Nothing. Silence. Then, just as he was about to turn back, he caught a faint sound, footsteps. Slow and soft, but distinct. He spun on his heel, his hand instinctively going to his weapon, ready for a confrontation. Through the darkness of the hallway, a figure emerged. It was her Ella, but there was something different about her. She wasn't the same scared girl he had found earlier. The weariness in her eyes had been replaced by an intense focus, and there was something almost hypnotic in the way she moved. "Ella, what are you doing?" Marcus called, his voice edged with urgency. She didn't reply. Instead, she continued walking toward him, her footsteps echoing in the silence. There was an eerie calm about her, too calm for someone who had just been on the brink of death. "Ella." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, there was something almost otherworldly about her gaze, something powerful. And then she spoke. "You gave me your blood," she said softly, her voice low and almost seductive. "And now I owe you more than just my life." Marcus froze. He hadn't expected this. His heart began to race. "Ella, you need to listen to me. The Empire is coming, dash." But before he could finish, she was standing in front of him, her hand resting lightly on his chest. "You saved me, Marcus Grayson." Now it's my turn to return the favor, in ways you cannot yet understand." She moved closer, her fingers trailing down his armor, the touch almost electrifying. Her voice was steady, but with an undercurrent of something darker, something powerful. "You saved my life, and now, I'm going to save you." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. His mind was a whirlwind, trying to understand what was happening. He had saved her, given her my blood. He thought, but this wasn't just about gratitude anymore. Her lips brushed against his ear as she whispered, "I can offer you more than just survival, Marcus. I can give you something no one else can." Before he could respond, her lips captured his in a kiss that was both gentle and consuming, a wave of heat rushing through his body. The kiss was soft, but there was an undeniable power in it, a force that seemed to invade his very senses. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a connection, something deeper than the simple exchange of affection. The world seemed to slow around him, the weight of the battle, the stress of the mission, everything else vanishing in that single moment. Chapter 4. The Power Unleashed. The heat of the kiss faded, but the electric charge between Marcus and Ella lingered in the air like a faint, unspoken promise. Marcus pulled back slightly, his breath ragged. His heart still pounded in his chest, but the reality of the situation slowly returned to him. The battle, the Empire's approach, the lives at stake, it all came flooding back. He stepped away, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, as though trying to erase the lingering taste of her. His mind was still in turmoil. He had no idea what was happening, what she had just done, or why it felt like the world was shifting beneath him. But there was one thing he knew. This was no ordinary girl. "What do you mean by save me?" Marcus's voice was strained, the edge of confusion and disbelief still apparent in his tone. "We don't have time for games, Ella. The Empire is coming. We need to focus." She stood still, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. There was no trace of weakness in her now, no fear. In fact, she looked almost in control of everything around her, and it was both unsettling and mesmerizing. "I'm not playing, Marcus," she said softly, her voice low and full of confidence. "I'm trying to help you, help us all." Marcus shook his head, stepping back. "We need to focus on surviving. The Empire will tear this place apart." Ella's gaze softened, but there was a glint of resolve in her eyes. Slowly, she reached up and touched the side of his face, her fingers cool against his warm skin. Her touch was gentle, but it carried a weight. "I know how this ends, Marcus," she whispered. "I've seen it before. The Empire will destroy this world unless we fight back, and if we fight back, you'll need more than just your soldier's instincts to win this." Marcus frowned, unsure whether to believe her. Who was she really? How could she know so much about the Empire's plans? Why was she so confident? But the unease he felt wasn't just from her words. It was the sense that something deep was at work here, something bigger than both of them. Before Marcus could respond, the sounds of blaster fire and explosions echoed from the outer edges of the bunker. His heart skipped a beat. "They're here," he muttered under his breath, his training kicking in as he turned toward the command center. Ella's hand tightened around his arm, her grip surprisingly firm for someone who had just been moments away from death. "Marcus," she said, her voice low but commanding. "The time has come. The battle starts now. You'll need to trust me." The weight of her words hit him harder than any explosion could. It wasn't just about the fight anymore. It was about trusting her, trusting himself, and trusting the Ceredics, the warship they had stolen from the Empire. He turned back to her, his expression hardening with determination. "All right, let's see what you've got, Ella." The Empire's assault had begun. Massive Corsian warships descended onto Outlaw's Haven like a swarm of locusts, their guns firing in rapid succession. The resistance was scrambling, trying to hold the line, but the odds were overwhelming. The city was being torn apart. The streets were filled with dust, smoke, and the sounds of battle. Marcus took charge immediately, barking orders to his team, while Maravas prepared the Ceretics for their final escape plan. But something was different now. Something had changed in the air. "We've got incoming forces, Sergeant," one of the soldiers yelled, his voice thick with fear. The tension in the air was palpable. The Empire's ships had already deployed ground troops. The first waves of Corsian soldiers were marching into the bunker's perimeter. They were closing in. Marcus gritted his teeth. It wasn't supposed to end like this, but it didn't have to. Ella, now's your chance, Marcus shouted, turning toward her. She nodded without a word, and suddenly, the air seemed to shift. The Ceratics, stationed at the far end of the base, let out a low rumble, and Marcus could feel a faint vibration in the ground beneath him. Something was happening to the ship, but it wasn't the usual engine startup. This was different. Ella moved toward the heart of the battle, her steps no longer weak but strong, filled with purpose. She raised her arms, a soft hum emanating from her, vibrating through the very air. The temperature dropped for an instant, and Marcus watched in disbelief as the Corsian soldiers before them began to freeze in place, their movements slow and sluggish. "What is this?" Marcus asked, his voice almost a whisper. Ella turned her head to look at him, a mysterious smile curving her lips. "The power I gave you is the same power I possess." She extended her hands, and a shockwave rippled through the battlefield. Energy surged from her body, sending the Corsian soldiers flying backward, their weapons knocked out of their hands. The Ceratics' systems suddenly flared to life in sync with her movements. Laser turrets aboard the warship targeted the incoming enemies, opening fire with extreme precision. The battle had turned. Marcus blinked, trying to comprehend what was happening. "This is impossible. You're Dash. I'm more than a survivor, Marcus." Ella's voice rang with certainty as she turned to face him. "I am the key to the Ceratics' power, and you've unlocked it." She raised her arms once more, and a massive shockwave erupted from her, engulfing the battlefield. The Corsian forces were caught off guard. Within moments, their command was in disarray. "We've won this battle," Ella said, her eyes glowing with the power she had unleashed. But then, her gaze softened, and she looked at Marcus with something deeper, something more intimate. Marcus's heart pounded. There was no denying it now. He had unknowingly set off a chain of events that had not only saved their lives, but also uncovered a hidden power buried in the depths of the Ceratics and in Ella herself. Before he could speak, Ella approached him, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw as her lips brushed against his. This kiss was different from before. It wasn't just gratitude anymore, it was a promise, an exchange of powers and fates intertwined. The battle raged on, but in that moment, Marcus knew the war wasn't over yet. They had just begun to uncover the true nature of their enemy and what Ella was capable of.